Thank you. Dr. Craig, how do you respond to Dr. Ayala's claim that God is the greatest abortionist?
Well, I think that's very pejorative. I mean, that's emotionally loaded language. Most miscarriages occur because the fetus is in some way deformed. So this is actually, I think, an expression of the mercy of God. These fetuses that are spontaneously miscarried are fetuses that will be born with horrible handicaps or other sorts of disabilities. So this is actually a mercy, I think. And of course, I believe that God is the author and creator of all life, and He has no obligation to prolong anyone's life. If God wanted to strike me dead right now, that's perfectly within His prerogative. I have no claim on a certain amount of life. So I see God as sovereign and providentially in control of the world, and it's entirely within His prerogative what sort of life to give a person and how long that life should be. We have no sort of presumption upon that. It's a gift of God for which we can only give thanks for whatever we do have.
It is correct that most of the spontaneous abortions happen because the developing embryo is defective. It is defective because the design of the human reproductive system is very defective. So still one has to account why the design of the reproductive system is defective. A very interesting issue arises with respect to the problem of explaining why we have a world that has all these problems if God is the creator. I don't have a very good answer. If I would have a very good answer, I will convey it to you. But let me give you a beginning of an answer. God could have created human beings that don't have freedom, that were robots. There will be no crimes, no sins. The robots are not a good substitute for humans. So it's better to have humans. God could have created a world without evolution. Then it would have been a very dull world, a living world. The millions of species that arise and the tremendous relationships between them give a tremendous beauty to the world that God has created. So it's better to have a world in evolution, even if there is predation, abortion, and all sorts of other things happening. And the same with the world of the galaxies. We have earthquakes and we have all the sorts of things happening in the universe because it's a dynamic world. God could have created a static world. At least I think He could have created a static world. How to set the rules as to what God can do or not. But the world in which this dynamism occurs is much more interesting.
Dr. Ayala, do you as a Christian believe that the flaws found in nature's design existed before the entry of sin into the world?
There is a problem with the sound coming from you to me, and I cannot understand hear well.
Do you, as a Christian, believe that the flaws found in nature's design existed before the entry of sin into the world?
Well, of course, there is this explanation which is perfectly acceptable for people from some forms of Christianity which are not the ones that I would subscribe, that it was because of the fall that all these things happened. Many of the problems that we have mentioned occurred before there were humans around, the behavior of the baboons and everything else. Thinking, as I saw in the Museum of Creation on Saturday, I was there, they took me that before the fall, the lions ate vegetables, they don't eat other animals. It's not, at least to me, very convincing. I could make my statement a little more assertive and more disagreeable, perhaps, for those who agree with that view. But to me, it's not very convincing that predators became predators after the fall, and before there were no defects, and before there were no spontaneous abortions.
I think here we begin to see some of the subtlety of the various theodicies that can be offered for animal pain and suffering. I certainly do think that these forms of behavior, these so-called flaws or predation and so forth, pre-existed before the advent of human beings on this planet. But William Dembski offers a very interesting theodicy for animal pain. He argues that God foreknew that human beings would fall into sin and exhibit the kinds of evil behavior that Dr. Ayala described, and therefore He created a world which is, in a sense, already fallen before the advent of human beings in it, because it will then be a suitable environment in which sinful human beings can be brought to their senses through suffering and difficulty and so forth, and in which God will call out people into His kingdom, inviting them to find salvation, forgiveness, and moral cleansing through the gospel of Christ. So Dembski has a very interesting theodicy which sees these aspects of nature as indeed deficits. It's different than the theodicy I gave. He sees them as deficits, but he sees them as preemptively introduced by God because of God's foreknowledge of the human fall into sin. So just again, it shows that the kind of subtle issues that this can get into, they're not easy to resolve.
Okay. Dr. Craig, if the design hypothesis that you put forth is actually viable, then it seems that the designer must have a viable mechanism of action. Does the designer go in with scissors and tape to rearrange the genome to create changes not attributable to natural selection? What mechanisms do intelligent design theorists propose for this, and are the mechanisms testable?
This is an excellent question. Because the ID camp really is a big tent. It includes people who are theistic evolutionists like Behe and Denton down to people who are six-day creationists. And so they will propose different kinds of mechanisms. What they all agree is that undirected processes would not lead to this kind of biological complexity. So one attractive view would be a kind of progressive creationism which would see God as intervening periodically in the evolutionary process to cause, say, systemic macro-mutations that would in all probability never occur by random chance, but which God causes in order to bring about what would otherwise be, a hopeful monster, that is to say, some very radically different life form. And then He allows natural selection and random mutation to take its course. So that would be one possibility, a kind of progressive creationism. Behe, in his most recent book, argues for non-random mutations of some sort, that these would be mutations that would be directed by God, leading ultimately to humanity. So I think there's any number of alternatives, and this would be one of the interesting research projects that ID theorists ought to engage in.
It is very strange for me to think of a process of evolution that is going on, and then once in a while God has to put His hand there to cause some macro-mutation or second mutation. For me, it's just very difficult to comprehend scientifically, philosophically, or theologically. And I'm going to make another point, and I will have the forgiveness of those of you who believe, like the things that are in the Creation Museum, that things change after the fall. You know, so I'm expressing my views. I'm trying to convince anybody, and why I have problems with certain views. It's hard for me to imagine that the human reproductive system change after the fall as a consequence of sin. So as a consequence of sin, now we have 20 million innocent babies dying every year. So I insist, I don't want to persuade people of different ways of interpreting Christian faith, but I want to know where my problems are.